I stood on the sidelines of the tennis court, holding my racket, pretending to focus on my daughter's match. But my eyes were drawn to the far end of the court, where Ashley stood, laughing too hard at one of Coach Joel's jokes. He was the kind of guy you'd picture coaching a women's team, tall, tanned, always confident, with that perfect smirk on his face like he knew he was better than the rest of us. My heart tightened as I watched her gently place a hand on his arm, a touch too casual. Too intimate. She was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. It felt like someone had kicked me in the gut, but I kept my face blank. I couldn't make a scene. Not yet. Ashley, can we go? Practice is almost done, I said, my voice flat, betraying none of the anger that boiled inside me. Just a second, Paul, she replied, her eyes still fixed on Joel, like I wasn't even there. That was the moment I knew. Something in me snapped, but I wasn't the kind of guy who yells or throws things. No, I decided right there on that sunlit court. I'd handle this quietly, carefully. They thought I didn't notice, that I was just another oblivious husband. But they were wrong. I started paying attention to every little thing after that. The way Ashley's phone would light up late at night with texts she never mentioned. How she'd rush out the door for extra errands, or stay late at work without a good reason. All of it pointed to one person, Joel. A week later, I came up with a plan. I wasn't going to confront her right away. I wasn't going to shout or cry. Instead, I'd hit them where it hurt. I had one goal now, to destroy Joel. Slowly, methodically. He wouldn't even see it coming. I began by planting my phone, set to record, inside my gym bag whenever I accidentally left it behind at practice. The next day, I listened to their conversations. Nothing explicit, but the flirting was obvious. Those laughs, the whispered compliments, the way Ashley's voice softened around him. The more I listened, the angrier I got. But I kept calm. The game had just begun. Soon, it wasn't just about the affair. Joel was a terrible coach, though no one seemed to notice. I watched him berate the kids, push them too hard, humiliate them for small mistakes. He was good at hiding it, but not from me. I knew where to look, and what to listen for. My daughter, thankfully, was spared his worst behavior, but others weren't so lucky. I began collecting every bit of dirt I could find. I filmed his tantrums during practices and caught him on tape mocking the kids when he thought no one was listening. The other parents either didn't see it or didn't care. They were too busy chatting, thinking their kids were being groomed for greatness. But I cared, and soon, the tennis federation would too. That night, as Ashley slept peacefully beside me, I took her phone and unlocked it. I'd seen her type in the password 100 times. The texts with Joel were worse than I imagined. Flirting had turned to something more, midnight meetings, secret messages. I read them all, my hands shaking with rage. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. I filed everything away, building my case piece by piece. I wanted it to be perfect. I wanted to ruin Joel's life the way he was ruining mine. Because soon, he wouldn't just lose his job. He'd lose his reputation, his career. And Ashley? She'd lose everything too. I spent the next few weeks living a double life, pretending everything was normal while silently gathering the pieces that would take Joel down. Ashley, wrapped up in her little fantasy, didn't notice. She still kissed me goodbye in the mornings and played the part of the loving wife. It was almost funny, how easily she believed I was blind to what was happening. Every day, I'd watch them, silently recording their moments. Ashley thought she was clever, but I knew her better than she realized. I knew when she was lying about being caught up at work or running errands. I knew she was with Joel. So, I started planting my phone in her car, recording her conversations during those so-called errands. It wasn't long before I had hours of incriminating evidence, enough to make sure their secret wouldn't stay one for long. But it wasn't enough to just catch them cheating. No, that would be too easy. I wanted Joel to lose more than Ashley ever could. He was a scumbag coach who had no place working with kids, and I was going to prove it. I started attending more of the practices, watching how he treated the kids, especially the ones who struggled. It didn't take long to catch him in action. During one practice, a boy named Tyler missed a volley and Joel exploded. He berated the kid in front of everyone, calling him weak and pathetic. The boy's face turned red, his eyes glassy, but Joel didn't stop. He kept pushing until Tyler was practically in tears. I recorded the whole thing. I didn't flinch, didn't intervene. Not yet. That night, as Ashley sat across from me at the dinner table, laughing with our daughter about something trivial, I felt a strange sense of calm. She had no idea what was coming. I smiled back at her, pretending everything was fine. But inside, I was counting down the days until it all unraveled. The next practice was worse. Joel snapped at a girl who hadn't been able to complete a drill, telling her she was a waste of time and that she'd never be a real athlete. The parents on the sidelines exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. I was the only one recording, the only one who saw this for what it was, abuse. After practice, I waited in my car, watching as Ashley and Joel lingered by the gate. She leaned in closer than she should have, her hand brushing his arm again. My stomach churned, but I kept the camera rolling. I wanted every second documented. When I got home, I sat in the dark of my office and began organizing the files. Each video, each voice recording was labeled and timestamped. I created a folder on my computer, titling it simply, Joel. Soon, the folder was overflowing with evidence. Enough to destroy him, but I needed more than just recordings. I wanted witnesses. I started talking to the other parents, casually at first. I'd bring up Joel's coaching style and mention how harsh he was with the kids. Some of them brushed it off, saying it was part of the sport, but others, especially those whose kids had been on the receiving end of his outbursts, started to agree. I could see the discomfort in their eyes, the hesitation. They knew something was wrong, but no one wanted to be the first to speak up. That's when I decided to push harder. I started leaving anonymous tips with the tennis federation, hinting at inappropriate behavior from Joel. I didn't reveal everything right away. I wanted to give them just enough to spark their curiosity, to make them start looking into him on their own. And they did. Within a week, Joel was under investigation. He had no idea it was coming. He still smiled that cocky smile at practice, and still flirted with Ashley like nothing could touch him. But the storm was building, and I was the one pulling the strings. The night I found out about the official investigation, Ashley came to bed, lying beside me like nothing had changed. She had no clue that everything was about to fall apart. That Joel's career, his reputation, everything, was hanging by a thread, and I was about to cut it. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I felt a strange satisfaction. The revenge wasn't just for the affair anymore. It was for everything Joel had done, to the kids, to my family. To me. And soon, he'd pay for all of it. The day it all came crashing down for Joel, I was there, watching it unfold like I'd scripted it myself. It started with a phone call from the tennis federation. They were launching a formal investigation into Joel's coaching practices after receiving multiple complaints. Multiple? That surprised even me. I'd only sent a few anonymous tips, but it seemed others had finally found their voices. My work was paying off, and the cracks in Joel's world were starting to show. At practice that day, Joel seemed off, distracted. He barked orders, but his usual confidence was missing. I stayed on the sidelines, pretending to be just another parent, but inside, I was savoring every moment. Ashley, of course, didn't notice. She was too busy whispering to Joel when she thought no one was looking. I wanted to tell her right then that the man she'd risked everything for was about to lose it all. But I didn't. Not yet. I wasn't done. The next few days were a whirlwind. The federation sent representatives to observe Joel's practices. Parents were called in for interviews. Some of them mentioned the verbal abuse. Others stayed silent, either out of fear or loyalty, but it didn't matter. I had the recordings and the videos. Joel was trapped, and the net was closing in. One evening, as I sat in my office, reviewing the latest email from the federation, Ashley walked in. "Paul, you've been spending a lot of time in here lately. Everything okay?" she asked. Her voice light, but her eyes searching. I looked up at her, the woman I'd loved for so many years, the mother of my child, and I felt nothing. The anger, the betrayal, it had all turned into something colder, harder. "Yeah, everything's fine," I said, forcing a smile. She nodded, seemingly satisfied, and left me alone with my thoughts. I knew she sensed something was wrong, but she was too wrapped up in her affair to dig deeper. And that worked just fine for me. By the end of the week, the investigation was in full swing. Joel was called into a meeting with the Federation's board. I wasn't there, of course, but I knew what was happening. They had my evidence, and they'd confront him with it. He'd probably deny it at first, try to charm his way out of it like he always did. But there was no charming his way out of this. The next day, Joel didn't show up for practice. Ashley looked confused, maybe even worried, but I kept my distance. Parents whispered on the sidelines. But no one knew the full story yet. I did, though. Joel was finished, and it was only a matter of time before everyone else knew it too. That night, Ashley came home late. She didn't say much, just kissed our daughter goodnight and went to bed without even glancing in my direction. I wondered if she'd seen Joel, if he'd told her what was happening. But it didn't matter. Whether she knew it or not, the end was coming. As I lay in bed beside her, I felt a strange sense of calm. I had done what I set out to do. Joel was falling, and soon, Ashley would realize what she'd thrown her life away for. 2 days later, it all came crashing down. Ashley walked into the house, pale and shaken. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee, waiting. I knew the conversation was coming, and I was ready. "They fired Joel," she said quietly, her voice trembling. He's under investigation for abusing the kids. There are videos and recordings. I don't understand how this happened." She sat down across from me, her hands trembling slightly. I set my mug down, locking eyes with her. "I do." She blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" I leaned back in my chair, the weight of what I was about to reveal pressing down on me, but there was no turning back now. "I'm the one who reported him. I'm the one who sent the videos to the Federation. Joel's been abusing those kids for months, and I made sure everyone found out." Her face went white, shock and confusion battling in her expression. "But how? Why would you?" I didn't flinch. "Because I know about you and Joel. I've known for a while now." Her mouth dropped open, but no words came out. I let the silence hang between us, watching as the realization sank in. She had no defense, no excuses that could undo the truth. "I recorded your conversations," I continued, my voice cold and steady. "I saw the texts, the late-night meetings, all of it, but I didn't confront you because I knew it wouldn't be enough. I wanted him to pay for everything, not just for sleeping with you, but for what he did to those kids." Tears welled up in her eyes as she shook her head, disbelief washing over her. "Paul, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It wasn't supposed to." "Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't sit there and pretend like you didn't know what you were doing. You made your choice, Ashley. You chose him over our family." She stared at me, her face crumpling as the weight of her actions crushed her. I could see the regret, the guilt, but it didn't matter anymore. It was too late. "What happens now?" she whispered, barely able to speak. I stood up, the coldness in my chest spreading through my veins. "What happens now? You're alone, Ashley. You've lost Joel, and soon, you'll lose me too. I'm filing for divorce." Her sobs filled the silence as I walked out of the room, leaving her there with the shattered remains of our lives. I didn't feel sorry for her. She had made her bed, and now she'd lie in it, alone. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I felt an odd sense of peace. The revenge was complete. Joel was gone, his career in ruins. Ashley had lost everything. And me? I was finally free. After our conversation in the kitchen, the house fell into a kind of eerie silence. Ashley walked around like a ghost, her eyes puffy from crying, her voice barely a whisper whenever she spoke to me or our daughter. She was still trying to hold on to the pieces of her life, but they were slipping through her fingers, and she knew it. I moved into the guest room that night. It wasn't just about the affair anymore, there was nothing left between us to save. The anger, the betrayal, the cold satisfaction of revenge, it had all consumed what little connection we had left. I didn't even look at her the same way anymore. Our daughter, Chloe, began to notice the tension. She wasn't old enough to fully understand what was happening, but she could sense that something had shifted. The laughter at the dinner table had disappeared. The conversations between Ashley and me had dried up, reduced to nothing more than logistical exchanges about Chloe's school or activities. I hated that Chloe had to be caught in the middle of this, but I couldn't pretend anymore. Ashley tried, though. She made half-hearted attempts at normalcy, smiling at Chloe, and asking about her day, but it all felt forced. I could see the cracks forming in her facade, the weight of her mistakes crushing her more each day. One evening, after Chloe had gone to bed, Ashley came to me. Her face was drawn, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. She stood in the doorway of the guest room, wringing her hands nervously. "Paul, can we talk?" she asked, her voice small. I didn't look up from the book I was pretending to read. "What's left to talk about, Ashley?" She stepped into the room, sitting down on the edge of the bed. I'm sorry. For everything. I never meant to hurt you or Chloe. I made a terrible mistake, and I know I've ruined everything, but A mistake? I cut her off, my voice colder than I intended. You didn't accidentally fall into an affair, Ashley. You chose to do this. You chose to betray me, to betray our family. There's no mistake here. Just decisions. And you made yours. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel the slightest bit of sympathy. I had given her everything, our life, our family, and she had thrown it away for a cheap fling with a man who was nothing more than a predator. I don't expect you to forgive me, she whispered, her voice cracking. I don't want to lose Chloe. She's all I have left. For a moment, I almost felt a twinge of pity for her. Almost. But then I remembered how she had looked at Joel, how she had lied to my face for months, and that pity vanished. I'm not going to take Chloe away from you, I said, my tone firm. But this marriage is over. You need to accept that. Ashley lowered her head, tears spilling onto her cheeks as she nodded in resignation. I know. Without another word, she stood up and left the room, the weight of her guilt trailing behind her like a shadow. In the weeks that followed, the cracks in our family became impossible to ignore. Chloe could feel the distance between us, and it was starting to affect her. She was quieter and more withdrawn. She'd always been a bright, happy kid, full of energy, but now it was like a cloud had settled over her. It killed me to see her like that. I tried to be there for her, tried to act like nothing was wrong, but it was hard. I was still going through the motions, living in the same house as Ashley. But every moment felt like a painful reminder of what we had lost. One day, as I was driving Chloe to school, she turned to me from the backseat. Dad, why are you and Mom not talking anymore? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I had hoped to shield her from the worst of it, but Chloe was too smart for that. She could sense the tension, the silence that hung between us like a storm cloud. I hesitated, trying to find the right words. Mom and I are having some problems right now. Chloe, but no matter what happens, we both love you. That's never going to change. Are you getting a divorce? She asked, her voice small like she was afraid of the answer. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, my heart aching at the fear in her eyes. We're figuring things out, sweetie. But you don't have to worry about that, okay? Chloe didn't say anything after that. She just looked out the window, lost in her own thoughts. I could see how much this was weighing on her, and it made me hate Ashley even more for what she had done. Not just to me, but to our daughter. That evening, after dinner, I found Chloe in her room, sitting on her bed with her tennis racket beside her. She loved tennis, something she had inherited from Ashley. But lately, even that had lost its shine for her. Hey, kiddo, I said, sitting down beside her. What's going on? She shrugged, picking at the strings of her racket. I don't know. I don't like tennis as much anymore. I frowned. Why not? You've always loved playing. She looked up at me. Her big, innocent eyes filled with sadness. It reminds me of Coach Joel. And Mom. I felt a surge of anger at Joel all over again. Even after everything, he was still affecting my daughter's life. You don't have to think about him anymore, Chloe. He's not part of your life anymore. But what about Mom? She asked, her voice wavering. I don't want her to go away too. I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close. Your mom's not going anywhere, Chloe. No matter what happens between us. She'll always be your mom. Chloe nodded, but I could see the uncertainty still lingering in her eyes. This whole mess had torn our family apart, and now it was affecting the one person who had nothing to do with any of it. As I sat there, holding my daughter, I realized that this wasn't just about me and Ashley anymore. Chloe was caught in the middle, and she was the one who would suffer the most. I had to find a way to protect her, to make sure she knew that, no matter what happened, she would always have a family. But how could I do that when the family she knew was falling apart before her eyes? The day I met with the divorce lawyer, it felt like another final nail in the coffin of what had once been my life. Sitting in that sterile office, flipping through legal documents that spelled out the end of our marriage, I couldn't help but think back to how things used to be with Ashley. How did we go from sharing everything, dreams, hopes, a family, to this? The lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Karen Summers, walked me through the divorce process like it was just another transaction. It was to her, of course, but to me, it felt like I was selling off the remnants of my past. We'll push for joint custody of Chloe, she said, adjusting her glasses as she scanned through the paperwork. Given what you've told me about Ashley's affair, it shouldn't be difficult to argue that you're the more stable parent right now. We'll also discuss the financials, division of assets, spousal support, and child support. I assume you want to keep the house? I nodded. It's Chloe's home. I don't want her to be uprooted any more than she already will be. Karen made some notes, then looked up at me. This isn't going to be easy, Paul. Ashley's going to fight for custody, and depending on how much guilt she's feeling, she might even try to paint you as the problem. I scoffed at that. Me? She's the one who destroyed everything. True, Karen said, but in cases like this, people get desperate. They'll twist things around to save face. Just be prepared. I left the office with a pit in my stomach, knowing the worst was yet to come. Filing for divorce was just the beginning. The real fight was going to be over Chloe. No matter how angry I was at Ashley, I couldn't forget that Chloe needed both of us, at least in some capacity. But would Ashley see it that way? Or would she try to hold on to Chloe as some last-ditch attempt to keep her life from completely unraveling? When I got home that evening, Ashley was waiting for me. She must have sensed what I'd been doing because there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was something else in them too. A determination I hadn't seen in weeks. Paul, she started, her voice trembling but firm, we need to talk. I stood in the doorway, not saying a word. I knew where this was going. I had been preparing for it ever since I decided to file for divorce. But that didn't make it any easier. I know you're filing for divorce, she said, confirming what I already knew. But you can't take Chloe away from me. She's my daughter too. I'm her mother. I finally spoke, my voice low and controlled. I'm not trying to take Chloe away from you, Ashley. But I'm going to fight for joint custody. I'm not going to let her life be torn apart because of what you did. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I saw the regret and guilt flashing in her eyes. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the same resolve that had gotten her into this mess in the first place. You think you can just erase me from her life? After everything? I'm not erasing you, I replied, my anger rising. But I'm not going to let you pretend like what you did didn't destroy our family. Chloe deserves stability, and you haven't exactly been providing that. Ashley's eyes narrowed, her hands shaking. You've been distant for years, Paul. This wasn't just about Joel. This was about us. I took a deep breath, holding back the storm that was raging inside me. Maybe you're right, maybe we were drifting apart. But you could have talked to me. Instead, you made your choice. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Finally, Ashley turned away, wiping her tears. I'll see you in court, she whispered before leaving the room. It was official now. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. It was about custody, about Chloe's future. And I was prepared to do whatever it took to make sure she had the best one. As the divorce proceedings ramped up, so did the battle over Chloe. We were both determined to do what we thought was best for her, but in reality, it was clear we were using her as the last weapon we had against each other. I hated that it had come to this, but I couldn't back down, not after everything that had happened. Our first mediation session was tense. We sat across from each other, barely able to meet the other's gaze, while the mediator, a calm, middle-aged man named Roger, tried to guide us through the process of figuring out a custody arrangement. Chloe is the most important person in this situation, Roger said, his voice steady. You both need to put aside your differences and think about what's best for her. I've been thinking about that since this whole thing started, I said, my eyes on Ashley. I want Chloe to have a stable home, and that's why I think it's best if she stays with me during the week. Ashley's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with anger. She's my daughter, Paul. You can't just take her away from me. I'm not taking her away from you, I countered. You'll still have her on weekends. But she needs stability, and given everything that's happened, I think I'm in a better position to provide that. Ashley's face went pale, her eyes filling with hurt. You think I'm a bad mother? I think you made bad choices, I said, my voice cold. And those choices have consequences. The mediator tried to intervene, calming us both down, but it was clear that this wasn't going to be an easy process. Every decision felt like a personal attack, every compromise a battle neither of us wanted to lose. But through it all, Chloe remained the center of my thoughts. She didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this war, and I hated myself for dragging her into it. But what other choice did I have? Ashley's affair had shattered everything, and I couldn't trust her the way I once had. At home, Chloe was more withdrawn than ever. She had heard us arguing, even though we tried to keep it from her. One night, as I was tucking her into bed, she looked up at me with wide, teary eyes. Dad, why are you and Mom fighting all the time? She asked. I sat on the edge of her bed, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. Mom and I are just trying to figure some things out, Chloe. But we both love you, and none of this is your fault. Are you and Mom getting divorced? Her question pierced through me like a knife, and I could barely manage to nod. Yes, Chloe, we are. Tears filled her eyes, and she buried her face in her pillow, her small body shaking with sobs. I felt helpless, completely powerless to make any of this better for her. I'm sorry, sweetie, I whispered, leaning down to kiss the top of her head. I'm so sorry. At that moment, I realized that winning custody wasn't the real victory here. Keeping Chloe safe, happy, and loved, that was all that mattered. But how could I do that when her world was falling apart? I wasn't sure anymore. All I knew was that I had to try. The divorce hearings dragged on longer than either of us had expected, each court appearance a fresh wound, each legal document another reminder of how irreparably broken everything had become. We had reached a tentative agreement on joint custody. Chloe would spend weekdays with me and weekends with Ashley, but nothing felt settled. Every exchange between us was filled with unspoken anger, regret, and resentment. One evening, after another mediation session that had left us both drained, Ashley showed up at the house unannounced. I had just put Chloe to bed when I heard the doorbell ring. Opening the door, I found Ashley standing there, her face streaked with tears, her shoulders hunched like the weight of the world had finally caught up with her. "Paul, can I come in?" she asked, her voice trembling. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let her in. She moved past me and into the living room, sitting down on the couch as though she were still living there. For a moment, the sight of her like that, broken and lost, pulled at something deep inside me. Despite everything, she was still the mother of my child. She was still someone I had once loved. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep pretending everything is going to be okay when it's not." I leaned against the doorframe, keeping my distance. "What do you want from me, Ashley?" She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "I want you to understand. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you or Chloe. I made a mistake, but it wasn't just about Joel. It was about us. We were falling apart long before the affair." Her words hung in the air between us, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. "Not after everything. You should have talked to me, Ashley. You should have come to me before it got to this point." "I know," she whispered, her hands trembling in her lap. "But I didn't know how. And then, everything just spiraled out of control." For a long moment, we sat there in silence, the ghosts of our past haunting every corner of the room. This had been our home once, our safe place, but now it felt like a battlefield. "I'm losing Chloe," Ashley said suddenly, her voice cracking. "I can feel it. She's pulling away from me, and I don't know how to fix it." At the mention of Chloe, my heart ached. This whole mess had hurt her the most, and now Ashley was finally realizing the full impact of what she'd done. "She's confused, Ashley. She doesn't understand why her family is falling apart." Tears streamed down her face as she buried her head in her hands. "I'm a terrible mother, aren't I?" For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I had wanted her to feel the weight of her actions, to see the consequences of what she had done, but not like this. Not when it was breaking her apart. I still couldn't forgive her, but seeing her this way, it was hard to hate her completely. "You made mistakes," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "But Chloe still loves you. You're her mom. That's never going to change." Ashley looked up at me, her eyes full of regret. "I just want her to be happy, Paul. I don't want her to grow up hating me." "She won't," I said, although part of me wasn't so sure. Chloe had already started to show signs of emotional distance, especially toward Ashley. The weekend visits were awkward, full of uncomfortable silences and stilted conversations. Chloe was struggling, and it was because of us. "I'm so sorry," Ashley whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "For everything." I nodded but didn't say anything. What was there to say? Sorry didn't fix what was broken. Sorry didn't make up for months of lies and betrayal. But at the same time, I could see that she was genuinely remorseful. Maybe it wasn't enough, but it was something. After a long pause, I spoke. "You need to focus on Chloe right now. This isn't about you and me anymore. It's about making sure she comes out of this okay." Ashley nodded, wiping her tears. "I know. I'm trying. But it feels like no matter what I do, I'm just making things worse." "Just be there for her," I said. "That's all you can do." She stood up, looking more fragile than I had ever seen her. I'll go. I didn't mean to bother you. I didn't know where else to go. I walked her to the door, unsure of what else to say. As she stepped outside, she turned to look at me one last time. Do you think we'll ever be okay? You and me? I didn't answer right away. The truth was, I didn't know. Maybe time would heal some of the wounds, but it was hard to imagine ever being close to her again. Too much had happened. Too much had been lost. I don't know, Ashley, I finally said. I really don't. She nodded, a look of quiet acceptance on her face, and walked away into the night. As I closed the door behind her, I realized that this was the closest we had come to talking, really talking, in a long time. But it still wasn't enough. It wouldn't ever be enough. Not for me. The weeks dragged on, and it became increasingly clear that Chloe was struggling. Her usual bright energy had dulled, and the sparkle in her eyes was gone. She was only 10 years old, too young to understand the complexities of what was happening but old enough to feel the emotional weight crushing down on her. The hardest part was watching her pull away from both of us. It wasn't just Ashley who was losing her connection with Chloe, she had started to withdraw from me too. The house was full of silence now, the only sounds being the faint creaks of floorboards and the hum of appliances. I missed the days when she would run up to me after school, excited to tell me about her day, or when we'd spend hours in the backyard playing catch or setting up her tennis net. One evening, I found Chloe in her room, sitting on the floor with her back against the bed. She was holding her old stuffed rabbit, the one she'd had since she was a baby. She didn't notice me at first. Her face clouded with sadness as she stared blankly at the toy in her hands. Hey, sweetheart, I said softly, leaning against the doorframe. How are you doing? She looked up at me, her eyes red from crying. I don't know, she whispered. I walked over and sat down next to her on the floor, unsure of how to approach this conversation. It felt like I was always saying the wrong thing these days, like no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't reach her. Do you want to talk about it? I asked gently. Chloe shook her head at first, her small hands gripping the stuffed rabbit tighter. But then, after a long pause, she finally spoke. I hate that everything's different now, she said, her voice shaky. I hate that you and Mom don't talk anymore. I hate that we don't do fun things together like we used to. I felt a lump forming in my throat as I listened to her. I had known she was struggling, but hearing it from her directly, hearing the pain in her voice, made it so much more real. I know, Chloe, I said quietly. I hate it too. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and filled with confusion. Why can't you and Mom just be friends again? Why can't we go back to how things were? I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. How could I explain to a 10-year-old that some things were broken beyond repair? That no matter how much we might want to, there was no going back. Sometimes, things happen between grown-ups that are really hard to fix, I said, choosing my words carefully. Your mom and I, we still care about you, more than anything. But we can't be together the way we used to be. But why? She asked, her voice cracking with frustration. Why does it have to be like this? I wish I could give you an easy answer, I said, feeling the weight of her question pressing down on me. But what I can tell you is that none of this is your fault. You didn't do anything wrong, okay? Chloe didn't respond. She just hugged her stuffed rabbit tighter and stared at the floor. I wanted to reach out, to hold her and tell her everything was going to be okay, but I couldn't lie to her. I couldn't tell her things would magically get better when I didn't believe that myself. I miss the way things were, she whispered. I miss us. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I miss us too. We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. I could feel the distance growing, and it terrified me. No matter what happened between me and Ashley, I couldn't lose Chloe. But it felt like I was losing her, little by little, every single day. The first weekend Chloe spent at Ashley's new apartment was rough. She had been dreading it for days, and I could see the anxiety building up in her as Friday approached. Despite everything, Chloe still loved her mother, but she was also deeply hurt, and it showed. I dropped her off at Ashley's apartment that Friday evening, feeling a strange mixture of relief and guilt. Part of me needed the break. Needed the time to clear my head without Chloe's constant sadness weighing on me. But the other part of me hated that I was sending her off into an environment that felt so broken and unfamiliar. Ashley greeted us at the door, trying her best to put on a brave face. She looked more put together than she had in weeks, Her hair styled, makeup carefully applied. But there was something fragile about her, like she was trying too hard to keep up appearances. "Hi, sweetie," she said softly, bending down to give Chloe a hug. Chloe hugged her back, but it was awkward, stiff, nothing like the effortless affection they used to share. "Hey," Chloe muttered, barely looking at her. I stood there, feeling like an intruder in what was supposed to be their time together. Ashley glanced up at me, her eyes silently pleading for something. For reassurance, maybe, or for me to say something that would make this less painful. But I had nothing to offer her. "I'll pick her up Sunday evening," I said, my voice tight. Ashley nodded, giving me a small, grateful smile. "Thanks." As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease settling in my chest. This was Chloe's new reality, splitting her time between two homes, two parents who couldn't even stand to be in the same room anymore. It wasn't fair to her. None of this was fair. When I picked Chloe up on Sunday, she was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made my stomach knot with worry. "How was your weekend?" I asked as we drove home. She shrugged, staring out the window. "It was fine. Did you do anything fun with Mom?" Another shrug. "We went to the park. She made lasagna." I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, trying to read her expression, but she was giving me nothing. Her face was a blank slate, completely shut off. It was like she had built this wall around herself, and I had no idea how to break through. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked carefully. "No," she said flatly. The rest of the drive was silent. I couldn't push her, not now, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe it was just the adjustment to this new routine, or maybe it was more than that. I didn't know, but the silence between us felt heavier than ever. That night, after Chloe had gone to bed, I found myself pacing the house, restless and uneasy. Something had shifted between me and my daughter, and I didn't know how to fix it. Every conversation felt like walking on eggshells, and I could feel her slipping away from me. Little by little, I picked up my phone, staring at Ashley's number for a long time before finally hitting the dial. She answered on the second ring. "Paul?" "Hey," I said, unsure of why I had even called. "I just wanted to check in about the weekend." "Chloe seems off." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Yeah, I noticed it too," Ashley admitted. "She barely spoke to me the whole time. I think she's still mad at me." "She is," I said bluntly. "But I don't think that's all of it. She's shutting down, Ashley." "I know," she said, her voice heavy with guilt. "I don't know what to do. She barely even looks at me anymore. It's like she hates me." I ran a hand through my hair, frustrated and helpless. "We have to figure this out, for her sake." "I'm trying, Paul. I really am." "I know you are," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "We just need to be patient with her." "Yeah," Ashley sighed. "Patience." But as I hung up the phone, I wasn't sure how much patience either of us had left. The tension in our house had reached a fever pitch. It had been weeks since the custody arrangement started, and Chloe wasn't adjusting. If anything, things were getting worse. Every time I dropped her off at Ashley's apartment, she came back quieter and more withdrawn. It was like she was building a wall around herself, shutting both of us out. One Friday evening, after dropping her off at Ashley's, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Chloe hadn't even looked at me when I said goodbye. And the usual awkward goodbye hug between her and Ashley was non-existent this time. I was used to seeing her sad or frustrated, but this felt different. She was disappearing, fading into a shell of herself. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of what I might be missing. Chloe was hurting, and neither Ashley nor I seemed to know how to reach her anymore. As much as I wanted to put all the blame on Ashley, I knew this wasn't just about the affair. Our family had been broken long before Joel came into the picture. On Saturday morning, I decided to check in earlier than usual. I needed to know how Chloe was doing. When I called Ashley, it went straight to voicemail. Strange. I called again. Nothing. I tried not to panic, but a sinking feeling was already creeping into my chest. What if something had happened? What if Chloe was in worse shape than we realized? I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, barely stopping to think. It was a short drive to Ashley's apartment, but every minute felt like an eternity. When I got there, I knocked on the door, my heart pounding. For a long moment, there was no sound on the other side. I knocked again, harder this time. Finally, the door opened, but it wasn't Ashley standing there. It was Chloe. She looked up at me with tired, red-rimmed eyes. Her hair was a mess, and she was still in her pajamas. She looked like she hadn't slept at all. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, crouching down to her level. "What's going on? Where's your mom?" Chloe glanced over her shoulder. Her expression flat. "She's sleeping." I stepped inside, immediately noticing the state of the apartment. Dishes were piled up in the sink, and the air smelled faintly of alcohol. Bottles of wine were scattered across the living room floor. I could hear the faint sound of snoring coming from Ashley's bedroom. "Chloe," I said carefully, "how long has your mom been asleep?" Chloe shrugged. "Since last night." My stomach twisted. I walked down the short hallway toward Ashley's room, finding the door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I saw her sprawled out on the bed, still fully dressed, an empty wine bottle on the nightstand. She was out cold. I stood there for a moment, watching her, anger bubbling up inside me. This was supposed to be her weekend with Chloe. She was supposed to be the responsible parent. Instead, she passed out in the middle of the day, leaving our daughter to fend for herself. I turned back to Chloe, who was standing in the doorway, watching me with a blank expression. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm as I could. She shrugged again. "I don't know. A while." "A while?" I echoed, my anger barely contained. "Why didn't you tell me?" She stared down at the floor, her shoulders slumping. I didn't want to make things worse. My heart broke in that moment. She was trying to protect us, trying to protect Ashley. And in doing so, she had been carrying this burden all on her own. "You should have told me, Chloe," I said gently, kneeling in front of her. "You don't have to deal with this by yourself. I just want everything to go back to normal," she whispered, her voice cracking. "But it never will it?" I didn't know what to say. How could I promise her that things would ever be normal again when I wasn't even sure what normal was anymore? All I could do was pull her into a hug, holding her as she trembled in my arms. "We'll figure this out," I whispered into her hair. "I promise." But as I held her, I knew that things had reached a breaking point. This wasn't just about me and Ashley anymore. This was about Chloe, and it was clear that neither of us had been there for her the way she needed. We were too wrapped up in our own anger, our own guilt, to see how deeply this was hurting her. I stood up and glanced back at Ashley, still unconscious on the bed. I couldn't let this continue. Chloe deserved better than this. She deserved parents who were present, who cared about her more than they cared about their own mistakes. "Go get your things," I said to Chloe. "You're coming home with me." She nodded, her eyes wide with relief, and hurried off to pack her bag. As I waited for her, I looked back at Ashley one last time. This was the woman I had once loved, the woman I had built a life with. But now, all I could see was someone who had lost her way, someone I barely recognized anymore. When Chloe returned with her bag, I took her hand and led her out of the apartment, not bothering to wake Ashley. I'd deal with her later. Right now, I needed to focus on Chloe. She was the only thing that mattered. As we drove home, Chloe sat quietly in the backseat, her gaze fixed out the window. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, my heart heavy with guilt. I had failed her, just like Ashley had. But I wasn't going to fail her again. Things were about to change. For all of us. After the incident at Ashley's apartment, I knew I had to confront her. Keeping silent wasn't an option anymore. I waited a day before making the call. Part of me wanted to give her a chance to realize her mistakes on her own. But the other part of me knew it was unlikely. Ashley was spiraling, and Chloe was caught in the middle. On Monday afternoon, I dialed her number. The phone rang several times before she finally picked up, her voice groggy and slow. "Paul?" she asked, sounding surprised. "We need to talk," I said bluntly. "About this weekend. About what's been going on." There was a long pause on her end. I could hear her shifting around, probably realizing I was about to address what she'd been avoiding. "What do you mean?" she asked, though I knew she understood perfectly well. "Ashley, Chloe told me everything," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "You've been leaving her alone while you drink yourself unconscious. This isn't the first time, is it?" Another silence. I could hear her breathing, and could almost feel the weight of her shame through the phone. I didn't mean to," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just, things have been really hard. I wasn't thinking." "Not thinking? She's your daughter," I snapped, unable to hold back my anger. "You don't get to just not think when it comes to her. You've been neglecting her, Ashley. She's been trying to hold it together for you, and you've been falling apart." Her voice cracked on the other end. "I know, Paul. I know I've messed up. I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I don't know how to fix it. I leaned against the kitchen counter, trying to calm the storm brewing inside me. You need help, Ashley. Chloe can't go back there until you get your life together. She needs stability. She needs to feel safe. I'm trying, she said, her voice filled with desperation. I really am, but everything feels like it's slipping away. I don't know how to stop it. Start by taking responsibility, I said, my voice firm but not unkind. You can't keep blaming the situation or me or anyone else. Chloe's the one paying the price for your mistakes, and that's not fair. I could hear her start to cry on the other end, her breaths coming in shaky gasps. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy for her, remembering the woman she used to be, the woman I had fallen in love with. But that woman felt so far away now, buried beneath layers of guilt, pain, and bad decisions. I'll do whatever it takes, she said through her tears. I don't want to lose her. I hope you mean that, I said quietly. Because I'm not giving you another chance if this happens again. There was nothing more to say. I hung up, feeling a mix of anger and exhaustion settle in. This wasn't the life I had envisioned when Chloe was born. I had wanted to protect her from everything, to shield her from pain and heartbreak. But here we were, and all I could do now was try to pick up the pieces. For Chloe's sake, I hoped Ashley would get her act together. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Over the next few weeks, Ashley seemed to be trying. She called Chloe regularly, checking in more often and even asking if they could meet for lunch. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of unsupervised visits yet, but I didn't want to stand in the way of them rebuilding their relationship. Chloe needed her mom, even if Ashley was a flawed version of the person she used to be. On the Sunday that Ashley was supposed to meet Chloe for lunch, I drove her to the cafe and waited in the car. Chloe seemed more excited than I had seen her in weeks, clutching a small drawing she'd made for Ashley, something about how they could hang it in Ashley's new apartment. I watched them from the car window as Ashley arrived. She looked different, a little more put together than the last time I'd seen her, like she had at least put in an effort. She hugged Chloe tightly, holding her for a few moments longer than usual, like she was afraid to let go. I leaned back in my seat, relieved to see Chloe smiling. Maybe this could work. Maybe Ashley could pull herself out of the wreckage and start being the mother Chloe needed. But as the minutes ticked by, that sense of hope began to erode. I watched from a distance as Ashley's face began to tighten, and the conversation between them seemed to shift from pleasant to awkward. Chloe's smile faded, and her small hands fidgeted in her lap. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I could tell something was wrong. After about an hour, Chloe came back to the car, her expression unreadable. She climbed into the back seat without a word, not even glancing in Ashley's direction as she pulled away. How did it go? I asked carefully, watching her in the rearview mirror. Chloe shrugged, her gaze fixed out the window. It was fine, she muttered, though her tone said otherwise. Do you want to talk about it? I pressed gently. No, she said firmly, crossing her arms over her chest. I didn't push her, but the pit in my stomach grew heavier. Something had happened. Something that had deflated the fragile sense of hope she'd carried into that lunch. Whatever it was, Chloe wasn't ready to talk about it yet. When we got home, she disappeared into her room without another word. I stood in the kitchen, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. I had wanted so badly for this to be a fresh start for them, for Chloe to see that her mother was trying. But it seemed like every step forward only led to more disappointment. Later that night, Chloe came into the living room, her eyes red from crying. Dad? She asked softly, standing in the doorway. I put down the book I was reading and motioned for her to come sit next to me. She hesitated for a moment before climbing onto the couch, curling up next to me like she used to when she was younger. I don't think Mom's ever going to be like she used to be, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I felt a sharp pain in my chest at her words. It was the first time she had voiced what we'd both been thinking for a while. I know, sweetheart, I said quietly, stroking her hair. But that doesn't mean she doesn't love you. I know she does, Chloe said, her voice wavering. But it's different now. Everything's different. I didn't have the heart to tell her that she was right, that this was our new normal. That the family we used to be was gone, replaced by something more fragile, more fractured. All I could do was hold her and let her know that, no matter what happened, I would be there. We sat like that for a long time, the weight of everything unspoken between us. Chloe's breaths eventually evened out as she drifted to sleep, her small body leaning against mine. I held her close, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over me like a heavy blanket. I couldn't fix this for her. I couldn't undo the damage that had been done. But I could be there, and I could make sure she knew that no matter how much things changed, she would always have me. Maybe that would be enough. I woke up to the sound of rain pattering softly against the windows, the kind of steady drizzle that fills the air with a sense of quiet melancholy. Chloe had already gone off to school, and the house felt unnaturally still. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee, my mind wandering through the events of the last few months. It felt like I had been holding my breath this whole time. Waiting for something to break, for Ashley to finally pull herself together, or for Chloe to stop hurting. But the truth was, nothing had fixed itself. Things were different, and there was no turning back. Ashley had kept her distance since the lunch with Chloe. There had been a few texts here and there, but no real attempts at reconciliation. It was like she had finally realized how far she had fallen and didn't know how to climb out. Part of me felt sorry for her, but mostly, I just felt tired. Tired of the back and forth, the broken promises, the hope that never amounted to anything. Chloe, for her part, seemed to have accepted the new reality. She still missed her mom, but she no longer clung to the idea that things would go back to how they were. In some ways, she was stronger than I had given her credit for. She had found her own way of coping, burying herself in schoolwork and after-school activities. I tried to be there for her as much as I could, but I knew I couldn't fill the hole Ashley had left. No one could. That evening, I got a call from Ashley. It was the first time she had reached out in over 2 weeks, and I couldn't help but feel a twinge of dread as I answered. "Paul," she said, her voice hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether I would even pick up. "What is it, Ashley?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I've been thinking," she said, pausing for a moment. "I think it's time I moved away. I've been talking to my sister in Portland, and she offered to let me stay with her for a while. I think it would be good for me." I didn't say anything at first. Part of me had expected this, but hearing her actually say the words still felt like a punch to the gut. Chloe had been holding on to the hope that her mom would stay, that maybe one day they could rebuild something from the wreckage. But now, Ashley was leaving, and this time it felt permanent. "I see," I said finally, setting my coffee down on the table. "And what about Chloe?" "I'll still call her," Ashley said quickly as if she had rehearsed this part. "I'll visit when I can, but I think it's better for her if I'm not around for a while. I need to get my life together before I can be a good mom to her again." I closed my eyes, trying to process what she was saying. It wasn't that I disagreed with her. Ashley did need to fix herself before she could be a positive influence in Chloe's life, but it didn't make the situation any less painful. "And you really think leaving is the best thing for her?" I asked, my voice tight. "I do," Ashley said softly. "I've been a mess, Paul. You know that. I've tried, but I keep failing. I can't keep doing this to her." There was a long silence between us, the weight of her words sinking in. I hated that she was right. I hated that this was the best option left, even though it felt like giving up. "When are you leaving?" I finally asked. "In a few days," she replied. "I wanted to tell you first before I talked to Chloe. I'm not sure how she's going to take it." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. "She'll be upset," I said honestly. "But maybe, in the long run, it's what she needs too." "I hope so," Ashley said, her voice trembling slightly. "I never wanted to hurt her, Paul. You didn't want to hurt her, but you did." I cut in, more harshly than I intended. "We all hurt her. We've both failed her in different ways, and now we're left to pick up the pieces." "I know," she whispered. "I'm sorry. For everything." I didn't say anything. What was there left to say? We ended the call, and I sat there for a long time, staring out the window at the rain-soaked street. Ashley's leaving was supposed to feel like closure, like the end of a painful chapter. But instead, it just felt hollow. There was no satisfaction in this, no sense of victory. Just loss. That night, I sat Chloe down and told her about Ashley's decision. She didn't cry as I expected. She just sat there, staring at the floor, her expression unreadable. "When is she leaving?" she asked quietly. "In a few days," I replied, watching her closely for any sign of emotion. Chloe nodded slowly, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "I guess I knew it was coming," she said after a long pause. "I don't think she wants to be my mom anymore." I flinched at her words, at the sadness behind them. That's not true, Chloe. She loves you. She needs to get better. She's doing this for you, so she can come back and be a better mom. I know, Chloe said, but her voice was hollow. She didn't believe it, and maybe neither did I. I'm sorry, sweetheart, I said, reaching out to hold her hand. I know this is hard. But I'm here, okay? I'm not going anywhere. She nodded again, though her gaze remained fixed on the floor. For the first time in a long while, I didn't know how to comfort her. No amount of words or reassurances could fill the void Ashley was leaving behind. Over the next few days, Chloe remained quiet but composed. She didn't talk much about Ashley, and when she did, it was always in short, clipped sentences. I could see the hurt in her eyes, but she was holding it in, trying to be strong. Maybe too strong. On the day Ashley left, she came by to say goodbye. I stayed in the background, giving them space. They hugged, exchanged a few words, and then it was over. Ashley was gone, and Chloe was left standing in the doorway, watching her mother walk away. That night, as I tucked Chloe into bed, she looked up at me with wide, sad eyes. Dad, do you think things will ever feel normal again? I didn't have an answer. Not really, but I knew I had to try. For her. Maybe not the old normal, I said softly. But we'll find a new one. Together. She nodded, curling up under her blankets. As I turned off the light and closed the door, I realized that letting go of the past was the only way forward, for both of us. Ashley was gone, but Chloe and I still had each other. And that, for now, was enough. We would be okay. Eventually.